Philippe Vasseur nous disait que cette initiative de ce forum, c'était d'abord pour partager du concret, des pratiques, des bonnes pratiques. Et c'est vraiment ce qui peut caractériser notre invitée aujourd'hui. Elle agit, elle a agi, elle agit, et elle va encore agir évidemment, avec un nombre qui l'a fait connaître au monde entier, 40 millions, puisque on a pu compter le nombre d'arbres qui ont été plantés pour reboiser des parties d'Afrique et surtout de l'Afrique de l'Est et surtout autour du Kenya d'où vous venez. Et c'est ce qui vous a fait connaître au travers de votre mouvement que vous avez créé en 1977, le Green Belt Movement, qui vous a apporté cette manière de reconnaître votre action avec ce prix Nobel de la paix en 2004. Et vous êtes présidente fondatrice de ce mouvement. Il y a 3 mots qui peuvent caractériser votre action, madame, celle du courage, de la générosité et puis aussi de l'ouverture. Le courage, vous en avez eu et vous en avez toujours pour imposer vos idées, imposer vos actions surtout auprès des gouvernements, auprès de votre pays, auprès du monde. Et le courage, on sait ce que ça veut dire lorsque, à certains moments, et ça a été votre cas, on a pu être privé de sa liberté d'agir et de se déplacer. La générosité, parce que pour mener toutes ces actions, et on parle bien d'action, il faut aimer les gens, il faut aimer le monde, il faut aimer la vie. Et je crois que c'est votre cas. Et puis aussi l'ouverture, parce que vous avez des actions environnementales très fortes dans votre pays et ailleurs, en Afrique. Mais vous avez dépassé le cadre de ces actions environnementales pour agir aussi pour que la femme ait toute sa place dans la société, pour agir pour les minorités, pour agir aussi vis-à-vis des incompris et pour agir sur ce sujet qui va nous préoccuper autour de ce 2e forum, qui est celui de cultiver la ressource de notre planète. Donc pour toutes ces raisons, vous étiez l'invité d'honneur qui s'imposait pour ce 2e rendez-vous. On est vraiment très heureux de vous accueillir et je vous invite à rejoindre la scène. Bienvenue, madame. Madame Wangari Maathai.
Thank you very much. You are most kind. Thank you very much, Mr. Vassar, honorable dignitaries, leaders of government, guests, and the people of Lille, wonderful town. Thank you very much for the very warm welcome on behalf of Wajira and I. We are honored to be at this World Forum. And I was personally very intrigued yesterday when we arrived at the Hermitage Hotel. And as soon as we went at the reception, I noticed that this was somewhere where the religious had been. And there were pictures of nuns, almost petrified. And I looked to the right, and there was a little chapel. And we went into that little chapel, and I couldn't help move back in time and realize that this is a place where there were people who believed in something, who served, people who needed support, who needed help, who needed service, and that they gave it very generously out of love for greater things, mostly out of love for God. And throughout the evening, my mind kept going back to this time in the past when these nuns lived in this beautiful building, which has now been transformed into a hotel. And I kept wondering what they would think if they were to come back, if they were alive today, and they saw the kind of life that we now live. And they would probably wonder what happened to the compassion, to the care, to the sense of service that must have dominated that period when those nuns lived. And then, of course, I remembered that I was here not to talk about the nuns in the past, but to talk about this wonderful World Forum, where we are looking at what we have done to our world and what kind of world we have produced for the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution started in this part of the world. And I guess my message essentially this morning would be, first and foremost, to learn, because we come to such meetings, first and foremost, to learn from each other, to encourage each other, to give hope to each other in this world, which at this particular moment, as the president of the conference has said, we are faced with a global crisis because stock markets all over the world are collapsing. But in a way, it's the nature of us that we are very concerned about the stock markets all over the world, because the rich are seeing their wealth collapsing. And we have learned to forget, and the President, Mr. Vasa, mentioned that. We have learned to forget that there is another world crisis that is going on every day of our life. Millions of people who are living below the poverty line, who cannot have a single meal a day, who are dying of diseases that can be prevented, who go without water, who do not enjoy the basic freedoms, millions of them. But we don't think that is a crisis. We have come to accept it, and we have come to almost believe that that part of the crisis will always be there. But those of us who have been following the history of the Norwegian Nobel Committee know that the Norwegian Nobel Committee, in its 100 years of history, has been trying to draw attention to the world on the issues that we need to address so that we can live in peace with each other. At the beginning, they focused on people who were engaged in wars, in conflicts, and they honored people who came to bring these fighting parties to the dialogue table so that they could negotiate peace. But in the course of its history, they also recognized that there is wisdom in preempting conflicts rather than waiting until the conflicts are occurring and we then try to bring peace to the dialogue table. And so they started honoring individuals who were trying to preempt these conflicts, who were trying to address issues which, if they are not addressed, eventually they will bring conflict and wars. And so we saw the committee honoring people who were fighting injustices, economic and political injustices, people who were working for human rights, people like Nelson Mandela, people like de Klerk, people like Martin Luther King. These are people who were bringing to our attention that not practicing justice, not respecting human rights, eventually creates sections of society that feel vulnerable, that feel sidelined, and sooner or later they begin to demand justice. And when they do that, sometimes they do it violently. And so, to promote justice, to promote social justice, political justice, economic justice, respecting human rights, respecting diversity that is common to all our societies, is one way of promoting peace by preempting the cause that would bring out conflict. And then in 2004, the committee decided that it was time for the world to change its mindset about the resources that we find ourselves having on this planet Earth. Because this is the only planet we have got so far. We haven't been able to find another planet to which we can escape. But on this planet, there are certain resources that we cannot do without. That if we don't have them, we cannot survive. And these resources are finite. And therefore, with the increasing population, there will be competition over these resources. And unless, as a human family, we learn to manage these resources in a responsible way, in an accountable way, that we learn to share these resources in a more equitable way, that sooner or later we are likely to fight over the few resources that will be remaining. In order for us to be able to manage them and to share them without conflict, we need to manage ourselves in the political systems and excuse me, and economic systems. Thank you very much. We need to manage them in political and economic systems that make that possible. For lack of a better word, we can say in a more democratic system. And in by democratic, generally, we can say societies which are open. Societies that allow for us to enjoy basic freedoms of movement, of association, of information access, of the press, of accommodation, inclusion. If we manage ourselves in such systems, in such political and economic systems, we are more likely to manage the resources we have in a more responsible way, in a more accountable way, and we are more likely to share them in a more equitable way, and therefore more likely to preempt the causes for which we fight. And indeed, if you look into the world and think of all the conflicts that we have at the moment, there are conflicts over competition to access, to control, to share resources. And where these resources are scarce or considered very valuable, that's where conflicts are. And I learned this relationship between competition over resources and conflict in my own country, Kenya, where we were fighting mostly over land distribution and water, and where we were being manipulated by politicians who were taking advantage of the ignorance of the general people, and especially during elections, manipulate them so that they would fight this, they would vote this way or the other way. And land and water were usually used by politicians as tools to manipulate the voters, because the politicians wanted power. But that power was being sought not to serve, but to give those in power the tools to access, control, and share those resources. And so I saw very clearly, first in my own country, amongst people who should be working very hard to overcome poverty, to overcome underdevelopment, to overcome diseases that can easily be prevented, to enjoy the resources that we have in a very beautiful country. Instead of investing in the people, we were investing in divisions and investing in competitions that eventually brought us conflict. And I started seeing that this was not only confined in my own country, but in the entire region of Africa. In a continent which is one of the richest in the world, we have some of the poorest people in the world. And there was something that was not tarrying here. How can you be in a continent that is so rich and have people who are so poor? It's about governance. It's about management of these resources. It's about ability and capacity to access these resources, to convert these resources into wealth, and to share these resources in an equitable way. And then I saw that indeed this is not only a phenomenon of Africa, this is a phenomenon even at the global level. And that is when I started seeing that indeed what we were dealing with is a global phenomenon of a situation where we have created global systems, global political and economic systems that allow a smaller number of people throughout the world to enjoy the finite resources that we have on the planet at the expense of huge numbers of people who live in poverty and in misery and who die of diseases that can easily be prevented. And despite the fact that there are so many, it's not a crisis. Nobody thinks about it. Nobody loses sleep about it. But you can be overwhelmed when you begin to understand the big picture and you begin to feel like people don't care and you begin to feel that you are a victim. You can be overwhelmed. But it's extremely important that we do not get overwhelmed, that instead we empower ourselves to take action, to begin to reverse that process. And the first and foremost, to begin to understand how that machinery works. And so I realized that I have to start from where I was. And without going into the details of how I started, I reached out to the women, perhaps because as a woman, it was easier to approach women, but also because in my part of the world, it's the women who first feel the burden of environmental degradation, because it's them who produce food, so they can feel it when the land is no longer able to produce adequate food. They can feel it when they are no longer having clean drinking water or have to travel long distances to look for that water. They can feel it when they don't have firewood to cook their food with, to warm their houses at night. They can feel it when desertification creeps on them. So I asked them, why don't we plant trees? And perhaps it was because of my biological background and a little bit of understanding of how biological systems work. And also because I grew up in the countryside. I collected firewood as a child. I fetched water from rivers. And we literally used to get water from the river and drink it. It was so pure. Now you can't, because we have developed and we have polluted our rivers with agrochemicals in the name of development. So I said, let us plant trees. A simple action, but to use it to educate and to empower. And so we started initially just to provide ourselves with very basic needs: firewood, building material, fencing materials, fodder for the animals, to stop soil erosion, to clean water so that soil doesn't get in the waters. And from there, we then started understanding that what is happening on our farms is partly as a result of what is happening upstream on the forested mountains. So we started thinking, how do we protect the forests? And then later on, we started realizing that the government that was supposed to protect those forests was the one that was destroying the forests, was the one that was allowing deforestation, burning of charcoal in the forest, cutting down indigenous forests, and making us lose the local indigenous biological diversity in the name of commercial plantations for timber, for paper, for buildings. But what we did not quite, or what maybe the government did not quite understand, is that when you destroy some of these indigenous biological diversities, not only do you destroy the forest and the capacity of those forests to receive rainwater, to conserve that water, to make sure that the rivers continue flowing, that the rainfall patterns are well controlled, and agriculture is well sustained. Not only do you destroy all that, but you also exterminate species that may never come back. And so we tried to make ourselves understand how these systems work and how the degradation of these systems eventually undermine our own livelihoods. And as we tried to do that, we got ourselves into trouble with the government, because people in power sometimes don't want to be reminded that what they have put on the table may not work. Maybe it will work in short term, but not in long term. So when you start telling them, think of tomorrow, they want to say, no, no, I'm worried about today. And poor people also sometimes, they want to worry about today. They don't want to worry about tomorrow. But as we have seen with this global financial crisis, and as Mr. Vasa said it so eloquently in his introductory speech, tomorrow comes sometimes too quickly. And so we need to worry about tomorrow. Certainly we need to worry about our own children, even if we cannot think into the future of their children or their grandchildren. Maybe we can at least worry about our children, just the next generation. And so when the Norwegian Nobel Committee was thinking of how it can carry this message to our generation, to explain to our generation that the time has come for us to change our mindset, to understand that we live on a planet that has finite resources, and that as long as we continue expanding in population, there is a level of consumption that this planet cannot sustain. And therefore, we need to change the way we live, the way we use the resources that are here. And that some resources, if they disappear from the surface of the planet, we ourselves will also disappear. And in closing, I want to mention, I know we have a lot of work today and the next few days, but in closing, I want to mention that quite often I live in a continent where people are very religious, almost as religious as the nuns who lived in the hotel where I'm now staying, and who, as I said in the morning, I have been thinking a lot since I arrived there. I tell them that, and especially because we come from Judeo-Christian tradition, at least that is the tradition that has now replaced our spirituality, and to a very large extent, that is one of the strong phenomenon that we see expanding in Africa is religious expansion, both Christian and Muslim and Islam. I tell them that if you read the Bible, especially the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, in a light touch, you will see that God, in his infinite wisdom, he created all the other species before he created the human species. The human species is created last. And in a light touch, when you think about it, God, in his infinite wisdom, decided to create us on the last day, say on Friday, when you think about the Jewish week rather than our Christian week. God must have started creating on Sunday. Now, if God did not have the infinite wisdom and created us on Monday, for example, many of us would have been dead on Tuesday, because there were not the essential elements for us to survive. Think about that. That should give us a certain amount of humility as a species, that we cannot live without the other species, but on the contrary, many other species can live very happily. In fact, many of them would thrive if our species was to move or was to be exterminated at the rate that we are exterminating other species. And so we should maybe change our perception of who is very important on this planet, perhaps to realize that we may be more intelligent than the other species, but perhaps we should be custodians rather than dominions of the other species. And in fact, amongst many theologians today, they are saying that there may have been some misinterpretation when the Bible says that man was given dominion over the planet, that perhaps it is a misinterpretation of the original concept, that perhaps we, the human species, were meant to be custodians of the other species. But when you think of how important these other species are, we can embrace a certain amount of humility. We are today worried about climate change and the greenhouse gases that we are pumping into the atmosphere. And I'm very happy that many companies who may be represented here today at this Lille World Forum, that there is a very wonderful movement amongst the companies, among the industrial sector and the business sector, of realizing that we need to be a little more responsible, that we need to be able to do business not only today but in the future. And therefore, we need to have a responsibility towards the environment as well. And I think that protection of forests in particular is extremely important. And I am goodwill ambassador of the forest, of the Congo forest, and I try to remind ourselves of the Amazon forest and the forest in Southeast Asia, and say that we need to make sure that our governments, now that they are negotiating the post-Kyoto protocol, that they make sure that forests, standing forests, and especially tropical standing forests, are included in the post-Kyoto protocol as part of the solution to the greenhouse gas controls. And this is partly because I was personally very surprised when I learned from the scientists that 20% of the greenhouse gases that are being pumped into the atmosphere are coming from deforestation and degraded forests, especially from the tropics. And that 20% is more than what is being produced by the whole transport sector put together. That was, for me, an eye-opener, because I thought that the transport sector is the major culprit. But to hear that the transport sector is not as harmful as the deforestation and forest degradation was, for me, an eye-opener. And I have therefore been pleading with all of us to speak to our leaders wherever we can, to persuade them that as they negotiate, and they are doing it now as we speak, the final negotiations will be done in Copenhagen towards the end of next year, that we make sure that especially the United States of America is on board and that forests are put there as part of the solution. I think that we shall continue to learn from each other in the course of the day and the next few days. I am extremely honored to be here with you. I am extremely grateful for the concern that all of us show. And we need to educate the world. We need to work together, as Mr. Vanessa said, so that we bring this message that the Norwegian Nobel Committee is trying to send, and is using the Nobel Prize to say that we need to worry about the environment, and the environment need to be at the center of our political and economic decisions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Philippe? Thank you. Just a moment.